The morning I decided to stop pretending. It was snowing. Not the pretty kind. Not the soft, cinematic flurries that made Ashvale Manor look like something off a Christmas card. This was New Hampshire, in February, doing what it did best. Cold, relentless, and completely indifferent to how a person felt standing in it. The wind off the hills cut straight through my hoodie and hit my skin like a reprimand. I stood on the east terrace with a mug of coffee I'd made myself, because the house staff didn't start until 7, and I'd been awake since 4. Old habit. When you grow up in a home where mornings were quiet and stillness was survival, you learn to be the first one up and the last one noticed. My name is Elliot Voss. I am 23 years old. I am an Omega. I have lived inside Ashvale Manor, the ancestral seat of the Callaway Pack, deep in the forested hills outside Concord, New Hampshire, for 14 months, and every single morning, I have stood on this terrace, with this mug, and pretended I wasn't listening to the emotions bleeding through the walls of this estate, like heat through cracked glass. That was my secret, not the coffee, not the early mornings. The fact that I could feel them. Every person in a 500-foot radius was an open book to me, not their thoughts, not their words, but the raw, unfiltered current of what they actually felt underneath all of it. Fear, anger, longing, guilt. I felt it the way you feel weather, pressing in from all sides, impossible to ignore, occasionally beautiful, frequently brutal. I never asked for it. It showed up when I was 12, during a particularly bad week in the group home in Burlington, Vermont, where I'd spent 3 years learning that silence was armor. One morning I woke up and I could feel every child in that building, their hunger, their grief, their small, stubborn hopes, like a chord struck inside my chest. I cried for 2 hours and told no one. I had told no one since. Here, at Ashvale Manor, the emotional noise was a lot. 3 alpha kings in one estate produced a frequency that sometimes made my back teeth ache. Caden Callaway, the eldest by 4 minutes, radiated authority like a furnace, constant, suffocating, and completely unaware of how much heat it threw. Reed, the middle brother, was quieter. His emotions came in long, slow waves, the kind that were easy to miss until they were suddenly all around you. And Jasper, the youngest, was a live wire. Every feeling he had arrived at full volume with no warning whatsoever. They were impossible. They were exhausting. And every morning, standing on this terrace, I felt exactly how complicated their feelings about me were. That part I hadn't figured out yet. The feelings were real. I'd stake my life on that. But real didn't mean good. Real didn't mean kind. Real didn't mean they saw me as anything other than the Omega their pack elders had quietly installed in their home 14 months ago, with very little explanation and even less fanfare. I took a sip of coffee. It had gone lukewarm. Perfect, I thought. Story of my life. Inside the manor, something shifted. I felt it before I heard it. The particular emotional signature of all 3 brothers awake at the same time, which almost never happened before 8. A pull of alertness, sharp and collective. Something had them up early. Then I heard voices. The terrace doors were thick, old oak, original to the 1890s construction of the manor. They should have muffled sound completely. But the latch hadn't caught right since October. I'd mentioned it to the estate manager twice, and been smiled at twice. And so there was a half-inch gap through which the heated air of the morning room bled out into the February cold, along with every word. They were speaking Occitanian. It was a Creole dialect, part French, part something older, spoken in maybe 4 parishes of Louisiana and approximately nobody's second language curriculum. Caden had lived in New Orleans for 3 years before coming back to take the Alpha King title. He'd picked it up there and brought it home like a souvenir, and now all 3 of them used it when they wanted privacy. What none of them knew was that I'd grown up speaking it. My grandmother had been from one of those 4 parishes. She'd raised me on it until I was 8. After she died, I'd kept it. Quietly, privately, the way I kept most things that mattered. It never came up. No one ever asked. So when Caden's voice drifted through that half-inch gap, low and almost bored, my hand tightened on the coffee mug, but my face stayed completely still. "He's still here," Caden said. In Occitanian, casually. The way you'd comment on furniture that hadn't been moved yet. A pause. Then Reed's voice, quieter. "Obviously? Where would he go?" And then Jasper laughed. Short, a little sharp. The way he laughed when something wasn't quite funny, but he needed it to be. "He follows us around like he thinks he belongs here. I don't know, it's a lot." I didn't move. Through my ability, I felt something underneath Jasper's laugh that didn't match the words at all. Something complicated and raw and almost desperate. But I'd learned a long time ago that what people felt and what they said were two entirely different countries. I set the mug down on the stone railing. "So that's where we are," I thought. I smiled, just slightly. Not because it was funny. Because I'd been waiting for 14 months to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Now I knew. And the most dangerous thing about me, the thing none of them had figured out yet, was that I was very good at waiting. What I was less good at was standing on a freezing terrace in February while 3 grown alpha kings discussed me like I was an unclaimed package they hadn't decided whether to keep. I picked the mug back up, took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, grimaced. Cold coffee and cold alphas. Truly, I was living my best life. Through the gap in the door, the conversation continued. They'd shifted slightly. I could hear the soft scrape of chairs, the clink of something ceramic, the particular domestic chaos of 3 large men occupying one morning room simultaneously. But the words kept coming, still in Occitanian, still unhurried, still carrying that particular flavor of ease that people only had when they were absolutely certain no one was listening. "The pack elders aren't going to wait much longer," Reed said. His voice was the most measured of the 3. Every word placed deliberately, like furniture arranged just so. They want confirmation of the bond status before the spring gathering. "There's nothing to confirm," Caden said flatly. A pause. "He's been here 14 months, Jasper said. His voice had lost the edge of that earlier laugh. Something quieter had replaced it. At some point, that becomes its own kind of statement. It's not a statement, it's a situation. Caden again. That furnace-warm authority, banking low. The elders placed him here. That doesn't mean we're obligated to." "To what?" Reed asked. Silence. Through my ability, I felt the room shift, all 3 of them landing on an emotion simultaneously that I could only describe as complicated. Not shame exactly, not guilt exactly, something in between that none of them apparently wanted to name out loud. I was familiar with that feeling. I'd been feeling it about them for 14 months. I turned away from the door. The east terrace overlooked the backgrounds of Ashvale Manor, 2 acres of snow-covered gardens that in summer were apparently extraordinary, though I'd only arrived in December and had experienced exactly 1 summer here, during which I'd been too busy learning the social architecture of pack life to pay much attention to the roses. A stone path wound through the white toward the tree line, where the forest pressed close and dark against the gray morning sky. I breathed out, watched my breath dissolve. The thing about emotion manipulation that nobody would ever romanticize if they knew about it was this. It didn't turn off, ever. It was not a faucet. It was more like having every radio in a building playing simultaneously at low volume. You learned to tune most of it out, but it was always there, and sometimes, in the wrong moment, one station came through so clearly it felt like a shout. Jasper was the one who shouted without meaning to. Even now, from inside the morning room, his emotional frequency was the loudest. That complicated not-quite guilt had sharpened into something else, something restless and reaching. I felt it the way you feel a hand hovering just over your shoulder without touching. Present, warm, uncertain. I found that more unsettling than the conversation itself. Because Jasper Calloway, who had just described my presence in his home as a lot, currently felt like someone standing at the edge of a diving board he desperately wanted to jump from and absolutely refused to jump from. Every single morning. Without fail. I had no idea what to do with that information. Correction, I had several ideas. All of them were terrible. The door opened. Not the terrace door, the side entrance, the narrow one that connected the terrace to the east corridor. It opened and Jasper stepped out, and for one unguarded second his face was completely open. Surprised. He hadn't expected me to be out here. I raised my coffee mug in a small salute. Good morning. His jaw tightened. The openness snapped shut. You're up early. I'm always up early. I turned back toward the gardens. You'd know that if you paid attention. A beat of silence. I felt the flicker of something sharp move through him. Not anger. Closer to embarrassment. Good. He recovered fast, because Jasper always recovered fast. That was his particular skill. The emotional equivalent of knocking something off a shelf and catching it before it hit the floor. He moved to stand at the railing a few feet away from me. Did not look at me directly. I did not look at him. We both stared at the snow-covered gardens like they were doing something interesting. Cold out, he said finally. February in New Hampshire, I agreed. Shocking development. Another flicker. Amusement this time. Brief and involuntary, like a match striking and immediately being smothered. He didn't want to find me funny. I found that fascinating. You should go in, he said. You're not wearing enough layers. I looked down at my hoodie, then up at him. He was in a thermal shirt and flannel pants, which, objectively, was not significantly more weather-appropriate than what I had on. You first, I said pleasantly. His eyes finally cut to me. They were dark brown, the Calloway family color. All three brothers had them, though each set read differently. Caden's eyes were assessment. Reed's were observation. Jasper's were question marks. Always. Even when his mouth was saying something closed off and territorial, his eyes were asking something he hadn't figured out how to word yet. Right now, they were asking something I absolutely recognized. How much do you know? Not about the language. He had no idea about the language. But something about my composure this morning, the steadiness of me, the way I wasn't performing smallness the way the pack expected Omegas to perform smallness, something was registering. I smiled at him. Calm. Easy. The smile I'd perfected in the group home when adults tried to read my face and found nothing they could use. I'm fine, Jasper, I said. I'm always fine. He looked at me for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then he went back inside. I turned back to the snow. I breathed out slowly. Through the walls of Ashvale Manor, I felt all three of them, Caden's authority, Reed's stillness, and Jasper's restless reaching. And underneath all of it, tangled up and unspoken, something that had been growing for 14 months, that none of them had named yet. I had named it. Weeks ago. That was the problem. I knew exactly what it was. I had sat with the knowledge for weeks, turned it over in my hands like a stone I'd found on a path, and wasn't sure whether to pocket or put back down. And I had made a decision about it that I was fairly certain would horrify anyone who understood the full picture. I was going to do absolutely nothing about it. Not yet. Not because I was passive. Anyone who had spent more than 48 hours in my company and still thought I was passive was working with a spectacular deficit of observational skill. But there was a difference between passive and strategic, and I had learned that difference early, in a group home in Burlington where being loud got you ignored, and being quiet got you information. Information was the only currency that never devalued. I went back inside at 6:47. I know the exact time because I checked my phone at the door, a habit left over from years of scheduling my own everything, with no one to remind me. The morning room was empty. The brothers had migrated somewhere deeper into the manor, their emotional signatures dispersing through the walls like heat through old plaster. Caden toward his study, Reed toward the East Library. Jasper was somewhere I couldn't immediately place, which was unusual. Jasper was almost always placeable. He moved through spaces like a disturbance, leaving emotional residue behind him that I could track like footprints. This morning, he was being uncharacteristically still. I filed that away and went to make fresh coffee. The kitchen at Ashvale Manor was the one room in the entire estate that felt genuinely lived in. Everything else was beautiful, in that careful, curated way of old money. The right furniture, the right art, the right level of tasteful restraint. But the kitchen had scuffs on the baseboards, and a drawer that stuck, and a coffee maker that was 3 generations newer than everything around it, because at some point, a Calloway had apparently decided that aesthetic consistency was less important than a good espresso. I respected that deeply. I was grinding beans when Reed walked in. He didn't announce himself. Reed never announced himself. He had the kind of presence that arrived quietly and stayed longer than you expected, like fog. I felt him before I heard him, that slow, deep wave frequency of his. rolling in and settling around the edges of the room. I did not turn around. "You're making that for yourself," he said. Statement, not question. "I'm making enough for two," I said. "Whether you want any is your business." A pause. Then the sound of him pulling out a stool at the kitchen island and sitting down. I permitted myself a small internal moment of satisfaction and kept my face completely neutral. Reed Calloway was the brother I had the hardest time reading, and not because his emotions were faint. They weren't. They ran deep and constant, the way rivers ran deep and constant, and if you were standing at the surface you might mistake the stillness for emptiness. I had made that mistake exactly once, in my first week here, and I had not made it again. What lived underneath Reed's composure was substantial, attentive, sometimes uncomfortably so. "You were on the terrace early," he said. I was. I poured water into the reservoir. I like mornings. In February. I like mornings in February too. I turned then, leaning back against the counter to look at him directly. This was a thing I did deliberately and with some frequency, because direct eye contact made most alphas slightly uncomfortable when it came from an omega who wasn't performing deference, and I had long since decided that other people's discomfort with my eye contact was not my problem to manage. I like the quiet, before everyone wakes up and the house gets loud. Reed looked at me with those observation eyes of his, measuring, not unkindly. "The house isn't particularly loud," he said. "Relatively speaking," I said. "Compared to 4 in the morning, everything is loud." Something moved through him then, faint, underneath the surface current. Not amusement exactly, something more like recognition. Like I had said a thing that landed somewhere personal and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He didn't, which was also very Reed. The coffee maker finished. I poured 2 cups, pushed one across the island toward him without ceremony, and picked up my own. He looked at the cup, then at me. Then he picked it up and drank. Small victory. I filed it. "The spring gathering is in 6 weeks," he said. There it was. I had wondered which of them would bring it up first. I had assumed Caden. Reed was more interesting. "I know," I said. "The pack elders will expect." "I know what they'll expect, Reed." I kept my voice easy, unbothered. The voice I used when I wanted to communicate that a topic was not going to rattle me even if the person bringing it up was hoping, on some level, that it might. "I've attended 2 of your family gatherings. I understand the format." He was quiet for a moment. Through his surface calm, I felt something shift. Something that wasn't quite guilt but lived in the same neighborhood. "Elliot," he said. "Just my name. Careful. The way you were careful with something you weren't sure how to hold." "Hmm?" He looked at the coffee cup. "It isn't." He stopped. I waited. "We didn't choose this situation," he said finally. I looked at him for a long moment. Felt the complicated truth underneath those words, the layers of it. The way that sentence was both an apology and an excuse, wearing the same coat. "Neither did I," I said. I picked up my coffee and walked out of the kitchen. Behind me, Reed said nothing. But through the walls, as I moved down the corridor toward my room, I felt him sitting very still at that island for a very long time. And underneath his stillness, something that felt almost painfully close to shame. Almost. That word followed me down the corridor like a second shadow. Almost shame. Almost an apology. Almost something real, breaking through the careful, managed surface of Reed Calloway. I had felt it clearly, the way you felt the first crack in ice underfoot, before the sound caught up to the sensation. Present, undeniable. And then the moment passed, and it was just me walking down a hallway in a house that wasn't mine, holding coffee that was getting cold again. I had a problem with cold coffee. I also had a problem with almost. My room was on the 3rd floor, east wing, which meant I had the best view of the grounds and the worst heating situation in the building. The radiator in my room operated on its own private schedule that bore no relationship to temperature, need, or logic. It clicked and hissed and occasionally produced warmth at times that felt genuinely random, like it was making creative decisions. I had named it Gerald. Gerald was not performing this morning. I pulled on a second hoodie over the first and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the snow still falling past my window. 6 weeks until the spring gathering. 6 weeks until the pack elders arrived at Ashvale Manor and looked at me, and looked at the triplets and started asking questions that nobody in this house had been willing to ask out loud for 14 months. The questions I had already asked myself. Alone, in this room, with Gerald being unhelpful in the corner. What exactly was I here for? The pack elders had placed me with the Calloway triplets under a designation I had been given exactly one document explaining. A 4-page summary of pack law that used the word provisional 17 times, without ever quite defining what it was provisional toward. The short version, as I understood it, was this. The Calloway Alpha Kings needed an Omega presence in the pack seat to stabilize their collective bond. Something about triplet alpha energy being inherently volatile without an Omega anchor. Something about pack law requiring formal bond establishment within 2 years. I had read that document 11 times. I had questions. No one had offered answers. What I had instead was Gerald, and cold coffee, and the emotional frequency of 3 Alpha Kings who felt things about me that none of them were apparently willing to examine in daylight. A knock at my door. I checked my internal sense of the floor. The emotional signature outside my door was Jasper. Restless, warm, and currently broadcasting something I could only describe as determined reluctance. He had decided to come here, and he was not happy about having decided that. "It's open," I said. He opened the door and stood in the frame without coming in, which was a very Jasper thing to do. Commitment without commitment. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Technically present and technically available to leave at any moment. He looked at me, then at Gerald. "Your radiator sounds terrible." "Gerald has good days and bad days," I said. "Today is a bad day." Jasper blinked. "You named your radiator." "I name things I spend a lot of time with." I looked at him pointedly. "I haven't named you yet. Consider that information." Something flashed across his face. Not offense exactly. Closer to the expression of someone who had prepared for a conversation and found the other person had rearranged all the furniture. He stepped into the room properly, which I noted, and closed the door behind him, which I also noted. "The east wing heating panel is in the basement," he said. "I can fix it." I looked at him for a moment. Through the emotional current coming off him, I felt the determined reluctance sharpening into something more genuine. He actually wanted to fix the heating. This was not a pretense. Jasper, under all the volatility and the territorial posturing, had a deep and apparently sincere need to fix things. I had noticed this before and found it both endearing and inconvenient. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I know I don't have to." He said it with a slight edge that I recognized as his version of "please stop making this harder than it is." "Do you want heat or not?" I considered the temperature in my room. I considered Gerald's deeply unreliable nature. I considered the fact that accepting help from Jasper Calloway at 7 in the morning felt like a small dangerous thing, the kind of small dangerous thing that accumulated quietly until one day you looked up and realized you were somewhere you had not planned to be. "Fine," I said. "Thank you." He nodded once, brisk, like we had concluded a business transaction. Then he didn't leave. He stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and looked around my room with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. My room was organized but personal. Books stacked by subject matter on the shelves the manor had provided, a photograph of my grandmother on the nightstand, a worn blanket I had owned since I was 16 that had no aesthetic merit and complete sentimental value, small evidence of a real person living in a space. I watched Jasper look at the photograph. "Your grandmother?" he asked. I was surprised he asked. I kept it off my face. "Yes." "She passed?" The restlessness in him settled slightly, like water after you stop stirring it. "I'm sorry," he said. And underneath those two words, I felt something completely unguarded and genuine, the kind of feeling that arrived before a person could decide whether to perform it or suppress it. He actually meant it. I looked at him standing there in my doorway, this complicated, volatile alpha who had called my presence a lot, an hour ago, in a language he believed I didn't speak, and felt something shift very slightly in the careful architecture of my own composure. I did not let it show. "The heating panel," I said. "Basement, you said." He refocused, nodded. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." He left. Gerald clicked once, as if in commentary. "Not helpful," I told him quietly. But I was looking at the closed door. And that was the problem with Jasper Calloway specifically. He did things like that. Small, unannounced things that arrived without warning and left without explanation, and you were standing there afterward trying to decide if they meant something or if you were just desperately pattern matching because you had lived in this house for 14 months, and your options for human warmth were limited to Gerald and a photograph of your grandmother. I was self-aware enough to know that was a real risk. I pulled my knees up to my chest and sat with that for exactly 3 minutes, which was the amount of time I allowed myself to feel uncertain before I reclassified the feeling as data and moved on. Group home survival skill, number 1. Emotions were information, not instructions. Feel them, file them, keep moving. What I filed this morning was substantial. Caden, dismissive in language, conflicted underneath. The word situation used to describe me. A man who led with authority because vulnerability had probably cost him something significant once, and he had decided it would never cost him again. Read, careful, layered, carrying something adjacent to shame that he would not name. A man who saw things clearly, and sometimes hated what he saw. Jasper, loud on the surface, genuinely soft underneath in ways that clearly alarmed him, a man who fixed radiators for people he was pretending not to care about. 3 brothers, 3 completely different fractures, 1 house, 6 weeks. I was going to need more coffee. I got up, straightened my 2 hoodies, and went back downstairs. The morning had properly started now. I could feel the house staff moving through the lower floors, the warm domestic hum of people doing their jobs with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Aldrin, the housekeeper, was in the east corridor. 2 of the groundskeeping staff were in the mudroom, and Caden was in his study with the door closed and his emotional frequency at that particular register I had come to identify as do not knock. I respected it. Not because he intimidated me, but because I had learned which battles were worth having before breakfast. I was halfway down the main staircase when the front door opened. I felt the arrival before I saw it. A new emotional signature, sharp and deliberate and carrying something I instinctively didn't like. The particular frequency of someone who had decided in advance how they felt about the room they were walking into. Performed confidence. Underneath it, something calculating. The woman who walked through the front door was beautiful in the way that certain things were beautiful, and also dangerous, like coastlines with bad currents. Dark hair, expensive coat, the kind of poise that came from being told your entire life that rooms rearranged themselves around you. She looked up and saw me on the staircase. Her smile arrived half a second too late. "You must be Elliot," she said. Her voice was warm and smooth and landed wrong in my chest, the way warm and smooth things sometimes did when the warmth wasn't genuine. "I must be," I agreed pleasantly. I came down the last few steps at a pace that communicated neither hurry nor retreat. "And you are?" "Serena Ashby." She said it the way people said names they expected to be recognized. "I'm a family friend. I've known the Calloways since we were children." I smiled at her. My best smile. The one that gave nothing away. "Lovely. I'll let the brothers know you're here." "Oh, they're expecting me." She was already moving past me toward the east corridor, familiar with the layout in a way that registered in my chest as a small, cold fact. She had been here before. Frequently, probably. "Caden invited me for the week. I'll be in the blue guest suite." She said it without looking back. I stood in the entryway and watched her disappear around the corner and felt, through my ability, the trail of her emotional signature moving confidently through the house, like she already owned the geometry of it. "A week," I thought. I turned that over carefully. Through the walls, I felt Caden's study frequency shift the moment she knocked. The door closed, do not knock register dissolved immediately into something open and warm, in a way I had not felt from him once in 14 months. Not once. I stood very still on the bottom stair. This was new data. I processed it the way I processed all new data, without rushing, without the luxury of feeling it fully, until I understood what it meant. What it meant right now, in this moment, was this. Caden Calloway had a week of warmth, reserved for Serena Ashby, that he had never once offered in 14 months of sharing a house with me. That was information. It was also, if I was being precise about it, the specific kind of information that sat in the center of your chest and applied quiet pressure. I was not going to call it hurt. I was going to call it data. From the basement, faintly, I heard the sound of someone working on the heating panel. Metal on metal. Deliberate, focused. Jasper, doing the thing he had said he would do. I breathed in slowly. My grandmother used to say that you learned more about people in the moments they didn't know they were being observed than in every conversation you ever had with them. She had been, among many other things, very correct about that. Caden didn't know I had been on that staircase. Jasper didn't know I could hear him in the basement, fixing the thing he said he would fix. And Serena Ashby didn't know that I had felt every layer of that calculated smile from 30 feet away. I knew all of it. I straightened my hoodie, went to the kitchen, made more coffee. 6 weeks, I thought again. A lot could happen in 6 weeks. What happened in the next 6 hours was already enough. Serena Ashby moved through Ashvale Manor like she had been practicing the choreography for years, which, I was beginning to understand, she had. She knew which cabinet held the good glasses. She knew that the drawing room fire needed the damper adjusted, or it smoked. She knew Caden took his coffee black, and Reed preferred his, with exactly 1 sugar, and Jasper would drink anything you put in front of him, as long as it was hot. She knew all of it, and she deployed every piece of knowledge with the practiced ease of someone making a point, without technically making a point. I watched, I said nothing, I filed everything. By noon, I had compiled a fairly complete picture. Serena Ashby had grown up in the neighboring Ashby Pack territory. Old family, old money. The kind of history that got referenced in Pack genealogy documents, the way landmarks got referenced on maps. She and the Calloway brothers had been entangled since childhood in that particular way of people whose families had always assumed they would eventually become one family. Not officially, not in writing, but assumed. The way weather was assumed. The way gravity was assumed. She was funny, genuinely, which I respected and resented in equal measure. She was sharp. She was comfortable in her own skin, in a way that I recognized, because I worked hard to project exactly that, and she apparently just had it naturally. And she looked at me, each time our paths crossed in the morning room or the corridor, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to be warm enough to be unremarkable, and just cool enough to communicate something that didn't need words. I was here first. I heard you, I thought at her, without saying anything. The afternoon folded in quietly after that. Caden and Serena disappeared into his study for what I gathered was some kind of pack business discussion. Reed went back to the library. Jasper finished with the basement and reappeared in the kitchen around 2, looking like he had been in a minor physical confrontation with the heating system, which he had won, but not easily. He had grease on his forearm, a small cut across 2 knuckles. He was washing his hands at the sink when I came in, and he did not look up. I got the first aid kit from the cabinet beside the refrigerator, set it on the counter next to him without comment. He looked at it, then at me. "It's nothing," he said. "I know," I said. "The kit's there anyway." I poured myself coffee, leaned against the counter. He finished washing his hands and stood there for a moment, looking at the first aid kit, like it had said something unexpected to him. And then quietly, almost carefully, he opened it and took out a bandage. I watched him struggle with the wrapper with slightly damp hands for approximately 4 seconds, before I set my coffee down, crossed to him, and took it from him. He went very still. I peeled the wrapper, and without making anything of it, reached for his hand and pressed the bandage over his knuckles. His hand was warm, much warmer than I expected, though I didn't know why I was surprised. Alpha body temperature ran high. I knew this. It was basic pack biology. There was no reason for the warmth of his hand to register as anything other than a physiological fact. It registered as something other than a physiological fact. I smoothed the edge of the bandage down and released his hand and stepped back and picked up my coffee, all in one motion, very naturally, as if my pulse had not done something briefly unreasonable. Jasper looked at his hand, then at me. "Gerald working?" I asked. He blinked, caught up. "Should be." I recalibrated the zone valve. It was completely off schedule. "Gerald operates on his own schedule," I said. "It's a personality trait." "Gerald," Jasper said slowly, like he was tasting the name, "is a radiator." "Gerald," I said, "is a radiator with character. There's a difference." Something happened to Jasper's face then. It was subtle and it was quick, and if I hadn't been watching carefully, I would have missed it. The careful distance he maintained, that 1 foot in 1 foot out architecture, softened. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Like a window opened in a room that had been closed all winter. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. And underneath that almost smile, I felt something from him that I had not felt clearly before, buried as it usually was under the restlessness and the volatility and the determined reluctance. Something quiet and aching and very, very tired. He was lonely. Not the surface kind of lonely that came from being in an empty room. The deeper kind. The kind that lived in a person who was surrounded by people and still somehow unreachable, and who had been unreachable for so long they had almost stopped noticing the distance. I knew that kind. I knew it the way you knew the layout of a house you'd lived in for years. I looked at him and felt the dangerous thing happen that I had been carefully preventing for 14 months. Not feeling. I was always feeling, but caring about what I felt, letting it matter. "Jasper," I said quietly. He looked at me. Those question mark eyes, open in the unguarded way they went when he forgot to manage them. "Thank you," I said. "For the heat." He was quiet for a moment. "Don't mention it," he said. His voice came out slightly rough. He cleared his throat, looked away. But he stayed in the kitchen, and I let him. That was the decision I would replay later. Not with regret exactly. More with the particular clarity that arrived after something broke. That sharp, almost peaceful understanding of the exact moment where everything changed direction. I let him stay. I made enough coffee for 2 without asking. I let the kitchen be warm and quiet and almost normal for 40 minutes, while the snow continued outside, and Serena Ashby was somewhere in the East Wing, being effortlessly at home, and the rest of Ashvale Manor did what it always did, which was exist beautifully and mean nothing personal. Jasper sat at the island. I stayed at the counter. We did not have a deep conversation. We did not have a revelatory moment. He told me the heating zone covered 3 rooms and I might need to crack the radiator valve manually the first time. I told him I had been doing that for 2 months. He looked briefly horrified. I found that genuinely funny and did not entirely hide it. It was 40 minutes of something I did not have a precise category for. Then Caden walked in. I felt him before the door opened. That furnace-warm authority, running at a frequency I had come to recognize the way you recognized a specific car engine from down the street. But there was something different underneath it today, something tighter. He had been with Serena for hours, and whatever they had discussed had left him carrying a weight he was now actively managing. He walked in and saw Jasper at the island, and me at the counter, and the 2 coffee cups, and the general atmosphere of the room, and something moved across his face that he shut down so fast I almost missed it. Almost. "Jasper?" His voice was level. "I need you in the study." Jasper straightened slightly. The open window in him closed. Not all the way, but noticeably, the way it always did when Caden used that particular tone. Old reflex. Oldest brother gravity. "Now?" Jasper asked. "Now." Jasper looked at me briefly. I looked at my coffee. He got up, and without making anything of it, picked up his cup and put it in the sink, like a person who planned to come back, which we both knew was not what was happening. He left. The kitchen was suddenly a different room. Caden did not leave. He moved to the refrigerator, opened it, looked inside with the focus of someone who was not actually looking for food, and closed it again, turned around, looked at me with those assessment eyes that always made me feel like I was being quietly categorized. I looked back, comfortable, unhurried. "Serena mentioned you met this morning," he said. "Briefly," I said. "She seems very comfortable here." Something tightened in his jaw. Imperceptible, probably, to anyone who hadn't spent 14 months learning his face. "She's family. Effectively." I nodded slowly, filed the word effectively. "That's nice," I said. "Family is important." He was quiet for a moment. Through his surface, I felt that tighter than usual frequency, the weight he was carrying, shifting, moving toward something. "Elliot." He said my name the way Reed had that morning. Careful, like something that required handling. "Caden," I replied, the same way, and watched something flicker in his eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of something else. "The spring gathering," he said. "We need to discuss what that means, for your position here." "My position." I held that word gently, the way you held something sharp. "All right," I said. "Discuss it." He looked at me for a moment, like he had expected a different response. Deference, maybe. Uncertainty. Some version of the performance the pack expected from an Omega in a conversation about his own future being decided by someone else. "Serena will be formally presented at the gathering," he said, "as a bond candidate." The kitchen went very quiet. Not actually. The refrigerator was still humming. The snow was still falling past the window. Gerald was probably clicking somewhere above us, doing whatever Gerald did. But inside my chest, something went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I processed the sentence carefully. Formally presented, bond candidate. The pack elders arriving in 6 weeks. The document I had read 11 times using the word provisional, 17 times. I understood now what it had been provisional toward. Not a bond with me. Never a bond with me. A placeholder arrangement, tidily concluded when the real candidate arrived with her expensive coat, and her knowledge of which cabinet held the good glasses, and her 15 years of assumed history with this family. I set my coffee cup down on the counter. Caden was watching me. Through his frequency, I felt the weight he was carrying shift again, and I understood with sudden, complete clarity what it was. Not guilt. Not quite. More like the feeling of a person who had been avoiding a conversation and had finally had it and now had to live in the aftermath of the other person's face. He was watching my face for the reaction. I gave him nothing. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice came out even and clear and completely my own. His jaw moved. "Elliot, the arrangement was always provisional," I said. "I know. I read the document." Silence. "All of it," I added. 11 times. I'm thorough like that." He looked at me. Something cracked open in his expression that he couldn't quite close in time. Not guilt. Something rawer. Something that looked almost like the beginning of understanding arriving approximately 14 months too late. I picked up my coffee cup, walked to the sink, rinsed it. "I hope the gathering goes well," I said. And I walked out of the kitchen with my spine straight and my steps even, and the quiet, devastated knowledge sitting in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water, still falling, not yet hitting the bottom. I made it to the second-floor landing before my legs decided they needed a moment. Not dramatically. I did not slide down a wall. I did not press my back against the wallpaper and close my eyes like a person in a film, making sure the audience understood they were feeling something. I simply stopped walking and stood at the window at the end of the east corridor and looked out at the snow and breathed in, out, measured. The grounds were white and still, and completely indifferent to the fact that I had just been told, very politely, very carefully, that I was a placeholder. That 14 months of living in this house, of learning these 3 men through every emotional frequency they produced, of cold coffee and Gerald and kitchen silences and bandaged knuckles, had been provisional, a holding pattern, a necessary administrative arrangement while the real plan came together. Serena Ashby, formally presented, bond candidate. I breathed out slowly against the glass and watched it fog. Here was what I knew about myself, and had always known. I did not fall apart in the moment. It was one of my more reliable qualities. In the group home in Burlington, when things went wrong, I was the one who stayed steady. Not because I didn't feel it, because I had learned early that falling apart was a luxury that required a soft place to land, and I had never reliably had one, so I had simply stopped scheduling it. I would feel this fully later, alone, in my room, with Gerald. Because here was the thing about emotion manipulation that was inconvenient in the current situation. I had felt Caden's face crack open. I had felt the rawness underneath his careful delivery, the thing that looked like understanding arriving too late. And I could dismiss that. I was prepared to dismiss that. What I was less prepared to dismiss was what I had felt underneath it, deeper than the guilt, deeper than the weight he had been carrying all day. Caden Calloway was not entirely sure he was making the right decision. That was not wishful thinking. I did not do wishful thinking. It was a clean, clear emotional read, the kind I trusted the way I trusted my own heartbeat. He was not sure, and he had done it anyway, had walked into that kitchen and delivered that information like a man completing a task he had convinced himself was necessary. I pressed my fingers against the cold window glass. The question was what I did with that. Option 1, nothing. Pack my emotional reality neatly away, maintain my composure for 6 weeks, attend the spring gathering as whatever I was designated to be, and then disappear from Ashvale Manor, quietly and permanently, with my dignity intact, and my secret still secret. Option 2, something. I was still working out the shape of option 2 when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Caden, whose tread I knew by its weight and rhythm, not Reed, who moved like fog and barely registered on floorboards. These were Jasper's footsteps, fast, slightly uneven, the footsteps of someone who had been in a study having a conversation and had left that conversation before it was finished. He appeared at the top of the stairs and saw me at the corridor window and stopped. We looked at each other across the length of the hallway. His emotional frequency was the loudest I had ever felt it. Not restless, not volatile, something much more direct than either of those things. He had been in that study. He had heard what Caden was going to tell me, or had already been told, or had put the pieces together the way quick people did when they were paying attention, and everyone assumed they weren't. "Elliot," he said. "Jasper," I said. He walked toward me, not slowly, not like a person being careful, like a person who had made a decision in the stairwell and was now executing it before he could talk himself out of it. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at me with those question mark eyes fully open. No management, no distance. "He told you," Jasper said, not a question. "He told me," I confirmed. "It wasn't." He stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. I didn't know he was going to do it today, like that. "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious. Like it was a memo. His voice came out rough at the edges. Like you were being informed of a scheduling change. I looked at him carefully. Through the directness of his frequency, I felt the thing underneath it. He was angry. Not at me. The anger was pointed inward and outward simultaneously, the tangled kind that arrived when a person realized they had been complicit in something by staying quiet. "Were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Before today." He held my gaze, did not look away. I didn't know how. "That's honest," I said. "It's not good enough," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." He exhaled, rough and short, ran a hand through his hair, in that way he had when the restlessness had nowhere productive to go. Then he looked at me and did the thing I was not expecting. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, that high alpha body temperature, radiating across the 2 feet of cold corridor air between us. Close enough that his scent registered fully for the first time. Cedar and something darker underneath. Snow-cold skin and something warm at the center of it. "I don't want you to leave," he said quietly, raw, unmanaged. My heart did something complicated. "Jasper?" His name came out softer than I intended. "I know it's not my decision," he said. "I know Caden is—" He stopped. "I just needed you to know that." I looked at him. 14 months of data. 14 months of question mark eyes and almost smiles and radiators fixed and bandages, and 40 minutes in a warm kitchen that felt like something real. I know, I said quietly. And for one long moment, standing in the cold corridor with snow falling past the window behind me, neither of us moved. The corridor held us in that suspended moment, the way cold air held breath. Visible, temporary, real. I could feel Jasper's emotional frequency at full volume now, no filtering, no distance. It was the most unguarded I had ever felt another person. Like every wall he had built and maintained and repaired over years had simply stopped being worth the effort all at once. I understood that feeling. I also understood that one person's honesty did not resolve 14 months of being treated like a provisional arrangement. Jasper's feelings were real. I had no doubt about that. But feelings and choices were different countries, and I had learned not to confuse the map for the territory. I stepped back gently, created space. I need to think, I said. He nodded. It cost him something. I felt that clearly. He nodded, and stayed where he was, and let me walk down the corridor toward my room, which was the right thing to do, and which I suspected was one of the harder things he had done recently. I sat on my bed. Gerald clicked twice. The heat that came through the radiator was steady and even, and genuinely warm, nothing like the unreliable cold of every morning before today. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I opened my door and went back downstairs. Both of them were in the study when I walked in without knocking, Caden behind the desk, Reed in the chair by the window, Jasper standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed and his jaw set, radiating the emotional equivalent of a weather warning. Serena was not there. That registered as significant and I filed it. All three of them looked at me. I closed the door behind me, stood in the center of the room, did not perform smallness, did not soften my posture or my expression into something more palatable. I need to say something, I said, and I need all three of you to actually listen, not process, not assess, listen. Caden opened his mouth. I am not finished, I said pleasantly. His mouth closed. Reed, by the window, went very still, in that way he had that meant he was paying complete attention. Jasper uncrossed his arms. I have lived in this house for 14 months, I said. I have been quiet. I have been undemanding. I have learned your schedules and your preferences, and every emotional frequency you produce, and I have asked for nothing, and explained nothing, and performed exactly the version of myself I calculated would cause the least disruption. I paused. That ends today. The study was very quiet. My name is Elliot Voss. I grew up in a group home in Burlington, Vermont. My grandmother was from Louisiana, and she raised me speaking Occitanian until I was 8 years old. I watched the color leave Caden's face in real time. I have understood every conversation you have had in that language since the day I arrived, including the ones about me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Reed closed his eyes briefly, opened them. His expression held the specific devastation of a man reviewing 14 months of private conversations and understanding the full weight of what had been said. Jasper made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Caden stood up from behind the desk. His face had moved through shock and landed somewhere rawer. Elliot. I know what you said, I said. Calm. Even. I know how you described me. I know the word you used was situation. I know Jasper said my presence here was a lot. I know Reed told you both things in that language that he was too careful to say directly to me. I looked at each of them in turn. I know all of it. The fire crackled. Snow tapped quietly against the study window. And I stayed anyway, I said. Not because I had nowhere to go. Not because I was passive or oblivious or too weak to leave. I felt my own voice settle into something certain and unshakable. I stayed because underneath everything you said, I could feel what you actually felt. And what you felt was never what your words said it was. Caden moved around the desk, stopped in front of me. Up close, his face was completely open in a way I had never seen it. All the authority stripped back to something much more human underneath. His eyes were wet. Caden Calloway, Alpha King, had wet eyes, and was not looking away. "I am sorry," he said. His voice came out rough and low and entirely genuine. "Elliot, I am so sorry." Through my ability, I felt it land. Not performed, not managed. Real. Reed stood from his chair and crossed the room and stopped beside his brother. "We were careless," he said quietly. "With someone who deserved every consideration, we failed to give." He looked at me with those deep-water eyes completely clear. "That was wrong. I was wrong." Jasper crossed the room in 3 steps, and before I could catalog what was happening, his arms were around me. Not asking, not hesitant, just completely and fully present, his face against my hair, his warmth surrounding me entirely. "I'm sorry," he said against my temple, rough and broken and real. "I'm so sorry, Elliot." My throat tightened. I let myself feel it. All of it. The 14 months and the cold mornings and Gerald and the provisional document and the weight of knowing things you were never supposed to know. I let it move through me like weather. Then I reached up and held on to Jasper's arm. Just that. Just my hand over his. "Serena," I said. "Already called," Reed said quietly. She understood. She knew, I think. She's perceptive. I pulled back enough to look at all 3 of them. These impossible, exhausting, complicated men. These 3 different fractures that somehow added up to something I had named weeks ago and refused to act on. "One condition," I said. "Anything," Caden said immediately. No hesitation. "Stop having private conversations in Occitanian." I looked between them. "Or learn that I will always understand them and adjust accordingly." Jasper laughed. Short and startled and completely real. The laugh he never let himself have. And it broke across the study like light through a window that had been painted shut for years. Reed smiled. Actually smiled. It transformed his face entirely. Caden reached out and took my hand with both of his. Careful. Like something he intended to hold properly this time. "No more secrets," he said. I looked at him. Felt the truth of it radiating clean and steady through his frequency. "No more secrets," I agreed. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Through the study window, the grounds of Ashvale Manor were white and still and open, and the late afternoon light was turning the whole world gold. Gerald, upstairs, clicked once. Finally, I thought, warm. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Hit subscribe. The next story drops soon.